Well, good morning, everyone. We doing all right today? Energetic? Barely. Are you tired from the oil change yesterday? Anybody in here participate in oil change? I got a few oil changers, yeah. I saw some of you there. It was such a good time. Anyway, hey, so today I want to start out by sharing a discovery that I made a while back, and you've probably made this discovery too, and that's that there are two types of people in the world. You know who they are? There are spenders and there are savers. And I'm not going to shame anyone, but I'm just curious, how many of you fall into the spender category? And I'm raising my hand honestly here. Yeah, some of you. How many of you fall into the saver category? Okay. Yeah. Now, this is so interesting because, and I don't have any actual proof of this. I think it's probably broken up 50-50, in the world. And you know the saying, opposites do what? They attract. Yeah. And so through all my years of premarital counseling that I've done with different couples, one of the things I've discovered is that most couples, a spender marries a saver and a saver marries a spender. That's not 100% always true, but most of the time that's kind of how it works out. And that dynamic has the power to create an incredible amount of tension and strife in relationships. And you've probably heard the stat that the number one reason people cite for getting divorced is money disagreements and arguments with money. And here's kind of the funny thing. If you're not married, if you're not dating anybody, sometimes this actually can exist within yourself, where there's part of you that wants to spend, part of you that wants to save, and we feel all kinds of stress and tension surrounding our money. And so I just thought it would be good if we talked about that today. So that's where we're headed today. We're in part 2 of this series, Secrets Rich People Know, part 2 of this series. And, I'm going to share the secret because rich people don't get stressed out about money, at least in such a way that it creates all kinds of tension and all kinds of stress. So we'll get to that in just a couple minutes. Now, if you're new with us for the first time in this series, my name's Seth, by the way. I forgot to introduce myself. And those of you online joining us, we're so glad to have you with us today. But we began this series last week, and we began by talking about this isn't a series on wealth. And the reason it's not a series on wealth is because if you live in the United States of America, you probably already are wealthy. In fact, if you make $33,000 a year or more, it'll take you only 30 years to make $1 million. And that means you're in the top 4% of wage earners in the world. Now, nobody seems very excited about that, but it's true. You're in the top 4% of wage earners in the world. And so our problem, it's not really a wealth problem as Americans. You know what our problem is? Our problem is a discontentment problem. Because advertisers are so good at telling us, here's something else you need, here's something else you should buy, here's something else that will make you happy. And we look at that thing and we think we'll buy it and we'll acquire it or we'll save it and then we'll be happier. And yet it just doesn't quite work out that way. We have been advertised to. Several years ago, we took our staff down to Atlanta for a conference. And down in Atlanta is a very magical place. It is the world of Coca-Cola. Some people like to go to Disney for their vacations. I enjoy going to the world of Coca-Cola. And at the world of Coca-Cola, there's this museum of Coke memorabilia. And at the end of your time, there's a Coca-Cola tasting room. And this is so much fun. There are like 100 different Coke products from around the world, and you get to taste all of them. And so for somebody like myself who has fear of missing out on anything, it's so exciting to try all of those different flavors. And so what was fascinating about this visit to the world of Coca-Cola is before they let you into the museum, they sit you down in a theater and they show you this incredibly beautiful movie. And it's a movie of people drinking Coca-Cola. Now, that doesn't sound exciting, but what they do, and they're so genius, and they're advertisers, right? They're so genius because they'll show babies being born, people drinking Coke. They'll show graduation day, people drinking Coke. They show marriages, weddings, people drinking Coke. There's this one video where there are these teenage boys at a balcony of a hotel trying to throw basketball into a hoop down on the beach below, and the celebration when they finally make one. And I tell you what, all across the world, they show these images of people drinking Coca-Cola. And by the end of the movie, I had tears streaming down my face. And you laugh, and I'm just being honest, right? Because I'm thinking about all the happy times in my life when I've had Coca-Cola. We toasted with Coke at my wedding. One of my best friends from college, he was a big Coke nerd and Coke memorabilia. And so, it was just, I'm just a sucker. And you know what had happened to me? I had been advertised to. I had been told that if I could just get a little bit more Coca-Cola, which they were about to let me have as much as I wanted in that Coke tasting room, I would finally be happy. See, discontentment is really our problem, and perceived discontentment is actually what gets in the way. It's not wealth. We have a lot of wealth in America. Our problem is discontentment. And so we said rich people, they understand two things. We let you in on two secrets last week, that even though not everyone gets to be wealthy, everyone can choose to be rich. Not everyone has the privilege of being born in the wealthiest nation in the history of the world, but we do. And that means we can also choose to be rich. There are rich people, I've met them across the world, who make far less than we make, who live with far less than what we live with, and who, quite honestly, are often far happier than most Americans I've interacted with. So it's not a wealth problem, it's a rich problem. And the question is, will we choose to be rich? And then the second thing we talked about is that no amount of wealth will make you rich as long as you are discontent. Because there is always something else to buy that could make you happy. There's always some other experience to go on, some other vacation. There's always a little bit more that you could save up so that retirement nest egg's just a little bit bigger. There's always something else. And if we don't tamp down that thing within us that can never be content, we'll never get to the place of actually getting to be rich. And so we said one of the things rich people do is that they just understand that there is something powerful within us when we say to our money, you no longer control me, I'm going to control you. That God does something, and it's kind of hard to explain, and we're going to try and explain a little bit more today, but when we control the money, rather than allowing the money to control us, it actually sets us free. And so one of the ways we do that, we talked about it, is choosing a percentage of our income to give, because we're basically saying, I have enough. Here's my spot, I have enough, I have extra, and because I have extra, then I can choose to be generous. And last week we said, you all have enough, you walked in with enough, so we gave you a little bit extra. And guess how much our church gave out last week? This is super fun. We gave out over $600. Isn't that cool? Yeah, I loved it. And it was so much fun to read on Facebook and social media, people tagging about what they did with the money. We gave you each an envelope. So if you weren't here last week, you missed it. Sorry, we did hand out money last week in one of these cool envelopes. And the invitation was to choose to be rich, to find an opportunity. And I loved reading about random acts of kindness or serving a coworker. I saw some teachers doing things for students. It was just really heartwarming. And for me personally, when I gave my money away, what an incredible experience that is. And so if you missed it last week, we've got an opportunity that you can participate with us again this week, and I'll share a little bit more about that in just a minute. Now, that's just kind of all by way of catching us up to where we were. I want to go back to the idea that it's possible you heard everything I said, and it's like, oh yeah, that sounds great. I'd love to give a percentage of my money away, blah, blah, blah. But the problem is, I don't know how. Like, I'm just stuck. And I feel overwhelmed. And the reason I feel overwhelmed is because I have some financial stress. I have some financial stress. Now, I just want to say, I understand this very personally. Over the years of my life, I have had various moments of financial stress, and I'm going to share just kind of how we dealt with our financial stress at the beginning of our marriage and how that transformed our marriage for the future. But I get that. And so I just want you to know, if you feel that today, I'm so glad you're here, because I hope to leave you with some hope as you leave here today. Now, the thing about financial stress, and this applies actually to all stress, you just need to know this, that stress will always be present, right? To live is to have stress. Stress is always going to be there. Stress will always be present. We always have things that weigh us down, whether it's at home, some issue at home, or whether it's with school and homework, or whether it's with if you're in a sport and practice, or in your relationship, in marriage and dating. There's stress in retirement. There's stress with our health. I mean, we just all have stress. Stress isn't necessarily good or bad. It's just stress, right? Life is stressful. Sometimes we impose stress on ourselves, and that's actually a good thing. When you exercise, you're imposing stress on your body, and that can be a good thing. That helps you get better. The problem is when we reach our limit. Now, I know you're not going to be surprised to hear this, but I used to weight lift back in the day. When I was in college, I was a weightlifter. And post-college, why are you laughing, right? I mean, it's clearly been a few years. Okay, I'll admit that. It's been a few years. But nonetheless, if you've ever weightlifted before, if you've ever bench pressed before, you know what I'm talking about. You get to a point where you can't push the weight anymore. And has anybody ever dropped the bar on your chest? You don't have to raise your hand, but I mean, it's a real thing. It's a real thing. I'll just say that. You nearly break your neck. It's a real thing when you drop the bar, because you have reached your limit. You've exhausted your margin. You've exhausted your margin, and your margin is the space between our present state and what our limit is. And the less margin we have, the more pressure we feel and the more stress we feel. Now, something that's kind of funny about us Americans is we don't like to admit that we have limits, do we? I mean, it's okay if somebody else has limits. We're okay admitting that somebody else may not have unlimited energy or unlimited time or whatever, but for ourselves, I mean, we just feel like we should be Superman or Superwoman. I mean, we feel like we should be able to do everything, but the truth is we all have limits. We have limits to our attention. We have limits to the amount of hours we can work, the amount of hours we can stay awake. We have limits with our patience. We have limits with our money. And the important thing is that the less margin you have, the more pressure and the greater stress you experience as you press against your limit and as you get to the point where you don't have any more room. As your margin decreases, your stress, by virtue, increases. Now, this applies to so many areas of life, and we could talk about all kinds of things that maybe we will in another series. Margin just is such an important thing to understand. But it especially applies in what we're talking about in the secrets that rich people know. Because the truth is, some of us in the room are spenders. I'm a spender. And if we're not careful, we can exhaust our margin. Our appetites can be bigger than our wallets. And we can say yes to so many things that we want to spend our money on that it creates some undue financial stress. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you have $5,300 in your bank account. Now, this actually happens to be the median bank account balance in the United States right now, $5,300. So school started. We've got 2 kids in school. That was $300. Boom, right there. Had no say in it. $300 other than we sent our kids to school. And we had kids, which we had a say in that. And then there comes birthday, right? And maybe there are some birthdays that come up and you're going to throw a big party for your kid and there's $500 there. And maybe your car breaks down. Suddenly you've got some car expenses or new tires or whatever it is and breaks and, $1,000 off of that. And well, I mean, you deduct that from $5,300 and you're still left with $3,500. Now, these are stressful, don't get me wrong. And some of it's good stress. Not all stress is bad. I mean, living life, having kids, birthdays, that's Christmas, whatever. I mean, that's all good stress. And because there's a little bit of wiggle room down there, it's not as stressful as it could be. But now imagine with me if you only had $300 in your bank account. And then school comes, and you kind of knew it was coming, but you weren't really able to plan as much for it as you wanted to, and suddenly your bank account's at zero. And then birthdays come, and you forgot it was that time of year, and then another $500 gets taken off of your birthdays, and then you're kind of $500 in the hole, and you think, well, I'll put it on the credit card. I don't want to do that, but I'll put it on the credit card and that'll give me a little more, that'll create some margin for me, if you will. And then, the car breaks down. Oh, it's like, oh man, the car broke down. There's $1,000 off. And suddenly before you know it, you're at negative $1,500. And you've exhausted your margin. And the funny thing is we think putting stuff on credit cards will solve our problem, but that doesn't actually solve our problem. It doesn't get rid of or it doesn't help our margin grow. It actually kind of puts a timer on things, and actually it can be damaging because over time you have to pay interest on that. And that robs you of future margin. It's a problem. And suddenly you start getting behind. And you're not sure what to do, and suddenly it just feels stressful. And the point is this stress happens. It does. There are normal, everyday things of life that are they create a stress. Not always bad. As I said, birthdays, Christmas, vacation. But then add to that the car breakdowns, the school fees, the birthdays, whatever. I mean, it just all begins to add up. And the less margin you have, the more stress it creates. And then you add to that mix that some of us are spenders. And we have big appetites, and we look at things and we say, ooh, that'd be fun to have. Ooh, that might make me happy. Ooh, that's shiny, and I'd like to have that. And that creates even more problems. Just curious, this is kind of an all case, so you all get to participate. Have you ever stumbled across something that you bought and you didn't remember buying it, and it was still in the package? Anybody able to admit that? Yeah, some of you are lying. That's okay. You're in church. I'll move out of the way for the lightning bolt so it doesn't hit those of you who are honest. Some of it, maybe you've ever opened a closet and you've seen clothes with tags still on them from years past. I don't know. Anybody? You don't have to fess up to it. That's okay. The truth is we've all done that. And what we don't realize is that those things actually cause stress to us as well. It causes stress because it fills our closet up with more stuff. It's more stuff that we have to wash, more stuff that we have to care for. Then sometimes we have interest payments on it because we did put it on a card, and then it took our money. It took some of our free money that could have been used for margin, and it just creates stress. And then you have a conversation in the relationship. And I stole this from a man named James Lenhoff. And we're going to interview James Lenhoff in a couple weeks. I'm super excited about that. But James Lenhoff describes this as go and woe. Go is often married to woe. Go likes to spend. Woe likes to control. Go has no limits. And from my point of view, woe has no fun. Right? I mean, that's just how it works. And so what happens is, you lose all the margin, and then suddenly you kind of snap back, and woe's like, hey, we don't have money to pay these bills. And when you have that conversation, nobody feels rich, do you? It doesn't matter how much you make. If you don't have money to pay the bills, nobody feels rich. And then go feels a little guilty or bad for having spent it and not told woe about it. And I mean, it just creates all kinds of stuff. And then the conversation moves to, do you know what we need? We need a budget. And do you know what go thinks about when he hears the word budget or she hears the word budget? Go thinks about this. No. This is what woe thinks about. This is what go thinks about. This is what go thinks about right here. They think about prison. They think about prison, how budget is just a prison. And it's going to keep us from having fun. Nobody hears the word budget, or few people are the goes in the room. They don't hear the word budget and think of paradise. They think of prison. And do you know what happens in the relationship when you're in budget prison? Do you know who woe becomes? Woe becomes this person right here. This is the warden from Shawshank Redemption, for those of you who don't know. One of the best evil villains in movie history. I don't know, a very evil person. And do you know what all this creates? More stress. It's just more stress. And it gets into a cycle. And then go has a great idea because something else shiny came along. And go is tired of living in budget prison. And so go nags, and convinces woe with some fuzzy math that we can do this. You know how fuzzy math works? Fuzzy math says, you know what? We can cut back on groceries, and we don't need to spend as much on groceries, and I'll ride my bike to work because, that'll be okay. And we'll figure out an extra $500 a month. And we just found $500 a month, so now we can afford the payment on this thing. And it'll be great, and we can have that. And woe reluctantly agrees, but the problem with fuzzy math is it never works out right. That's why it was fuzzy. Because eventually you forget that your teenage son eats $600 of food in a month. And then your teenage son has friends who also eat that much food, and they come over on a regular basis. And then it was rainy season, and you spent that extra margin on some car, and you want to drive the car, not ride your bike in the rain. And so before you know it, the margin's gone, and you're back to where you were. And that's the come to Jesus conversation that never makes you feel rich. It just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And your pay stub may say you're wealthy by percentages and, top 4% in the world. But without financial margin, you cannot feel or be rich. You just can't. Because you feel pressure and you feel stress. You know the secret rich people know? Rich people know that gaining and maintaining financial margin is the key to living stress-free, especially when it comes to money. The gaining and maintaining financial margin is the key to living stress-free. I want you to say with me, this is so important. We don't do this very often, but I just want this to sink in, okay? So on the count of three, we're going to say it together. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Gaining and maintaining financial margin is the key to living stress-free. Margin is the key. Margin is the key. Margin is the key. If you have no margin, you will have stress. If you can grow margin, you will reduce your stress. And as you grow your margin and have more margin, the stresses that come in life, they don't feel like the significant stresses any longer. And the thing you need to know is that credit cards don't solve it. Credit cards do not solve it. In fact, consumer debt is your enemy. It's your enemy when it comes to creating financial margin. And consumer debt is anything that is non-appreciating. So a house would not be consumer debt, but birthday is, Christmas is, vacation is, food, eating out, movies, whatever. Those all fall into the category of consumer debt. And do you know the truth about consumer debt here in America? Nearly half of households have credit card debt. And the average credit card debt of those houses who have it is nearly $15,000. Those families will pay over $1,200 in interest every year just for the privilege of purchasing what they wanted before they could afford to have it. Christmas back in 2016, the average family took out $1,000 in money on credit cards to help pay for Christmas. Shockingly, 65% didn't actually think they would go into debt. And they figured it would take them about 4 months to pay that off. The average family gains $1,100 in debt to take a vacation in the summer. And in our country right now, more than a third of Americans have a car loan, and the average value of the car loan is $30,000. Not including those who have leases, where you pay money every month and you walk away with nothing at the end of the lease. Now, I want to be really clear here because this is not about guilt. I am not trying to guilt anyone. If you feel guilt, that is not my intention. No, that is my heart. That is not my heart. My heart is that it is stressful and it is hard, but there is hope. There is hope of getting out of debt prison. There is hope of moving beyond the tension that we feel when it comes to our finances. And so I want to talk about a principle that's thousands of years old that can give us some hope as it comes to how to handle our resources. Now, this principle actually comes from a man named Solomon. Solomon was the son of King David. David, one of the most famous kings the most famous king in the nation of Israel. And Solomon was, he ushered in this golden era, this golden age in the nation. Solomon, when he was a young kid, became the king. And he had a dream, and in this dream, God came to him in a vision and said to him, Solomon, what do you want? Ask for whatever you want, and I'll give it to you. And Solomon had the foresight to pray and ask God to give him wisdom. And God honored that request. And gosh, I tell you what, if we could just pray that on a regular basis, all of us, we would pray God would give us wisdom. We would be in a much better place personally and as a globe. I mean, it would just be so much better. So Solomon, he prayed for wisdom, and God gave it generously to him. Much of his wisdom is recorded in the book of Proverbs. And in the book of Proverbs, there are two types of wisdom. There's one that's instruction. So Solomon's kind of giving some instructions. And the other one is just an observation. It's like, as I've gone about life, as I've lived my life, here's what I've seen, here's what I've experienced. And so the proverb we're going to look at today, it's an observation. It's not necessarily instruction, it's just an observation. Here's what Solomon said in Proverbs chapter 22, verse 7. He said, the rich. And when he says rich, he's talking about those who have more wealth than others, that have significantly more wealth. He says the rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender. The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender. He's saying, look, as I've looked around, as I've observed, I've noticed that those who have more wealth, they tend to rule over those who don't have as much wealth. Now, this wasn't a condemnation. This wasn't a value statement. Solomon wasn't saying those who have more wealth, they are so much better than those who don't have it. He's saying, look, this is an observation with a warning. And it's kind of like when we read this, lights should flash in our heads, the siren should go off, it's a trap, pay attention from last week. Or another way of saying it is this, that the borrower is in service to the lender. The borrower is in service to the lender. Because in the time period that this was written, nearly 3,000 years ago, in the ancient Near East, if you owed money to someone, you might ultimately become that person's servant. If you couldn't pay back what was owed, you would become their slave. That's a little different in our culture, but we do have debt collectors who knock on your door and garnish your wages and send people to collect the things that you have purchased that you haven't paid for yet. And the truth is, until debt is paid off, things are not equal in the relationship, are they? When you owe a debt to someone or an entity, things aren't equal in the relationship. One person or one entity has the upper hand. If you've ever borrowed money from a family member or a friend, you know exactly what I'm talking about. When they call up and say, you want to come home for the holidays? Do you have a choice in that? No. I mean, they're holding the mortgage of your house, or they're holding the deed to your car, whatever it is. I mean, they're controlling that. And when you eat their dinner, does it taste like freedom food? Not so much. It tastes like obligation food. You're there because you know that you owe them something. And the same is true in our relationships with entities and groups. And until we kind of have that paid off, things are not equal. Debt enslaves us. Nobody likes the feeling of being in debt. Nobody likes the feeling of being in debt. It is not a good feeling. And the thing is that God doesn't want it for you. And the thing I want you to know is he doesn't just want it for, or not want it for you because it's debilitating or demoralizing, even though it can be both of those things. He doesn't want it for you because debt is a spiritual thing. In fact, during this age of Solomon, during those golden years of the nation of Israel, people were free. They didn't understand what it was to be in slavery. But just a few years before that, the nation of Israel was enslaved. And you know who their master was? Pharaoh. They were slaves in Egypt, and Pharaoh was a terrible master. They were under his big, fat thumb. And whatever Pharaoh wanted, the Israelites had to do. And do you know what God did? He sent Moses to set them free, to bring them out of slavery, to take them into a promised land. And the last thing God wanted was for his people to be enslaved by something else. In fact, there's a book in the Old Testament. It's the book of Leviticus, a Jewish book, the book of law. If you like law, you might enjoy reading Leviticus. If you're new to Bible study, I wouldn't recommend starting there. You could go there later. You could start in Mark or Luke. But Leviticus gives us an idea of what God wanted for his people, because these are the laws that he established for these people who were his chosen people. So take a look at what he says in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 35. He says, if any of your fellow Israelites become poor and are unable to support themselves among you. Now, I want to be really clear that there were provisions that when people couldn't afford, they would have help. There would be social help. Now, it wasn't the idea of a person who was perfectly fully bodied, just kind of sitting around doing nothing. That didn't exist then. I mean, everybody's kind of on the verge of starvation during this time period. They didn't have refrigeration or anything like that. So he says, if any of your fellow Israelites become poor, unable to support themselves among you, help them. Help them as you would a foreigner and stranger, so that they can continue to live among you. And then he goes on, he says, do not take interest or any profit from them, but fear your God, so that they may continue to live among you. The goal is to keep them out of debt. I do not want my people going into debt slavery, because debt slavery is just another form of slavery, but it is very, very real. And so if someone can't manage, what I want you to do as my people, God's saying, is I want you to step up and help them. I want you to step up and support them and provide them an opportunity. Loan to them without interest. Now, the thing you should know is that was a revolutionary law 3,000 years ago. Exorbitant interest rates were the norm. So for God to step in and say, I don't want that for my people. I set them free so that they could be free. I don't want them to be enslaved. That gives you an idea of the heart of God. This was the idea of love your neighbor as yourself, right? I mean, Jesus, 1,000 years after this, would come onto the scene and ask, what are the greatest commandments? Love the Lord your God. Love your neighbor as yourself. This is how this is how God's people were to love their neighbor as themselves, to care for them. He goes on, he says, you must not lend them money at interest or sell them food at a profit. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. I brought you out of Egypt. Why? To set you free. I didn't want you to be slaves any longer. I do not want you to become slaves again. My people will not be enslaved again. Debt is just another form of slavery. He goes on, he says, if any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. Could he be more clear? Do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. They are to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Now, this is kind of an interesting concept, and you may not have ever heard of the year of Jubilee before, but every 50 years in the nation of Israel, Jubilee would take place, and basically this was an institution God had created to even the playing field of all people, because as people had debts, their debts were canceled in the year of Jubilee. Sometimes people would sell their land in order to pay for a living, and the land would be returned to those who had sold it. God was evening things out, saying, look, I'm providing for all of you. You are my people. My goal is to help you prosper. My goal is to set you free. I've given you this land. You're not going to hold it over somebody else. This land is my land. It's not your land. Long before Woody Guthrie ever came up with those words, 3 of you caught that reference, but that's all right. You won't become enslaved. I will not allow this land to enslave anyone. He goes on, he says, then they and their children are to be released in the year of Jubilee. They'll go back to their own clans and to the property of their ancestors because the Israelites are my servants. They are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt. They must not be sold as slaves. Because God understood that when we're enslaved to anyone or anything, that thing becomes our master. And God's vision for his people, and it's the same vision for us today, is that we would not be mastered by any card. We would not discover the land of interest payments. We would be free. And that without these laws, Israel would simply find themselves in slavery again. In fact, Jesus would 1,000 years later say this, no one can serve 2 masters. You cannot serve both God and money. You cannot serve both God and money. You cannot have 2 masters. I want to be your master. And we're going to get to more of that verse next week. But again, this is why Solomon in his wisdom, he said the rich rule over the poor, the rich rule over the poor, the rich rule over the poor, and the debtor or the borrower is slave to the lender. Now, wouldn't it be great if in our country we had laws like that? We have bankruptcy here, and that doesn't really set anybody free. That puts you in bad credit history and unable to purchase a house and, all wages garnished and all that terrible stuff. That's not free. And many people know, and maybe you know personally, what Solomon said, that debt enslaves us. Debt enslaves us. Even nationally, as we gain more and more national debt, it will only enslave us. But the thing rich people know is that gaining and maintaining financial margin is the key to living debt-free. It will enable you to get out, and it will enable you to stay out. And the incredible news that I want you to know today is that it is totally possible. It is absolutely possible. But the bad news for the advertisers is that it's going to mean you need to implement a lifestyle cap. Do you know what the lifestyle cap is? It's coming to the place where you say, I have enough. I have enough. I don't need any more. Now, average Americans, you know what average Americans do? They buy, spend, live. And then if there's any left over, they'll save a little bit. And maybe if there's a little bit after that, they'll give a little bit. Or if something tugs on their heartstrings or they feel guilty with the fireman holding the boot and they're driving through town. You give a little bit. But who wants to be average? Right? Who wants to be average? Do you want to raise average kids? Do you want to have an average marriage or live out an average retirement? Of course not. So let's not be average with our finances. Rich people understand that when we are able to gain and maintain financial margin, it's not accidental. It is not accidental. And I promise you, there are people who make far less than you who live with a far smaller lifestyle cap and who have made it work for themselves. It is possible. The good news is you don't need a budget. Budgets are like prison. Do you know what you need? You need a spending plan. This is for all the goes in the room. Yeah, a spending plan gives you freedom to spend money how you want to spend it. But it helps you to pre-think how you're going to spend it and what you want to spend that money on. It gives you permission to spend money in the areas where you've agreed that you should spend it, whether agreeing with a spouse or just agreeing personally with yourself. And saying, it's okay for me to spend money here. The truth is we all live on a percentage of our income, whether it's 70, 80, 90%, 125%. We all live on a percentage of our income. And if we don't put that cap in and say, okay, I'm going to live on less than 100% of my income, you'll never be able to gain and maintain margin. The typical average person lives first, saves second, and gives third. But I'd like to encourage you to flip the script on that and to give first, and to save second, and to live third. Now, I'm not going to tell you what percentage you should give or even where you should give it. I want you to hear me out on this. This is not about the church getting more money. It's not about you giving money here. In fact, pastors who tell you should invest in this ministry and God will give you back, they're lying to you, because if they believed it, they would be giving all of their money to their own ministries. But they're not. They're charlatans. So don't believe that. It's a bunch of lies, okay? The idea is that you give a percentage first. And the reason why it's important to choose a percentage is because as your income increases, our tendency to kind of lift that lifestyle cap increases, and we're always pushing up against that. And so when we choose a percentage, it just kind of forces us down. And choose a goal, set a goal percentage. You know what Carrie and I, years ago, we decided our goal was going to be 90%. We want to give away 90% of our income at some point in our lives. You know how close we are to that? Not very. But we move toward it every year. And we move in that direction regularly. So start somewhere, set a goal, and get there. And then save what comes next. And then live on whatever comes after that. Some people recommend 10%, 10%, 80%. Again, I'm not telling you what percentages you need to live up to. But when you begin saving and when you begin saying, okay, this month I was able to put $100 away. Well, guess what? That's $100 more margin that you didn't have last month. And set a goal of $1,000. That's not a bad goal for an emergency fund. Set a goal of $1,000. Maybe it'll take you 10 months to get there, but you're working toward it, you're getting there, and you begin saving. But then you have money when the stresses, the normal stresses of life come, and you're prepared for it. Here's the thing. We all have limits. We all have limits. And rich people understand that if we don't live by the limits we create, we'll be enslaved by the limits that get imposed on us. It is far better to set a limit on your spending to begin with than to have the credit card company or the debt collector set a limit on your spending on the other side. There is no freedom. There is no freedom in that place. But when we're able to gain and maintain financial margin, it will help you be stress-free. Does it sound impossible? I'm telling you, it is not. It is not, and I can say that firsthand. Believe it or not, I understand. When Carrie and I got married, we owed nearly $40,000 in debt. We had a car payment, we had education loans, we didn't have credit cards, but we had a lot that we owed. On a youth pastor salary and a part-time teacher, we got laser focused and we tamped down our lifestyle, and in about a year and a half, we paid off nearly $40,000. Was it hard? Absolutely. Do I regret it? Absolutely not. It was the best decision I have made aside from marrying my wife. It was the best decision we could have made in that first month of marriage. And the thing that I've discovered personally and the thing that I have seen others experience is that when you make the decision to be free from debt, God steps in. When you honor him first, when you give a percentage, whatever that percentage is, when you just say, I'm going to give first, I'm going to save second, and I'm going to live on what's left, God steps in and honors that. And I can't explain it. You get a raise that you weren't expecting. You get a promotion or a new job that you weren't anticipating. Somebody gives you money or pays for something that you weren't even thinking. I mean, you had no idea. And God works his fuzzy math, which is far better than your fuzzy math, trust me. And he steps in because he doesn't want you to be enslaved by anything. He wants you to be free. And man, when we paid off the end of that debt, I cannot tell you how freeing it felt. You can do it, but it requires making a spending plan, choosing to give first, save second, and live on what's left. So this week, I want to invite you to participate with me. We're going to continue on, and I want to give you a challenge. Hopefully you kept your envelope. If you didn't keep it, we've got extras for you on your way out. But here's what I want to invite you to do. I want you to think about your week, the expenses that you have this week. I'm going to help you tamp down your lifestyle a little bit. Whether you like to go get coffee or eat out or do whatever, I want you to just think about something that you could cut out this week. And I want you to take that money, whether it's $5 or $10, and stick it in your envelope. And then ask God to give you an opportunity to choose to be rich. Begin experiencing what that's like. when God works through you to impact someone else's life. Again, the stories I heard this last week were amazing. My own experience, and I get this stuff. It was such a rich experience. Don't miss out. I want to invite you to participate in that. It's a great opportunity for you. And then the last thing, I want to invite Liz and Kelby Owens out. Liz and Kelby Owens, they attend our Greensburg campus. Kelby is a financial planner, and Liz is a counselor. They're an incredible couple. We often say we've got the best couples at both of our campuses. They're the best people, not just couples. We've got the best people at both of our campuses, and you guys are part of that. And so we're beginning the class, Freed Up Financial Living, and Liz and Kelby participated in that a couple years ago. I wanted to just ask, what caused you to take the course, Freed Up Financial Living? Thanks. Everybody welcome Liz and Kelby, by the way. We're glad to have you guys here.
For me, whenever I was changing careers about 5 years ago, it was perfect timing because that's when we signed up for the class. And whenever I was getting into a new industry, I wanted to make sure I understood about finances and money and what the Bible was teaching us. So we needed a biblical perspective of why, because Jesus talks about money a lot, and I wanted to take that into my job. So then on a personal level, Liz and I wanted to make sure we were on the same page because I'm the saver and she's the spender. And
high five, Liz.
And so whenever I would try to introduce a budget, she felt like the prisoner, on the slide that you showed. And then also, it was a security thing for me having, being able to know we had enough money. And so it kind of controlled me a little bit. Some of my high school friends would say I was like Scrooge McDuck. I would just be swimming in money by this time because I never would spend any money. I was so tight with it. So we were definitely on different wavelengths and we needed to come together.
So how did the class kind of help you move forward as it comes to managing your finances?
So it helped a lot with our communication, I would say, about finances. I would say prior to whenever he would want to talk about finances, I would just be mad, honestly. I was just kind of mad and I didn't want to do it. And so it really gave us time to focus on and to think about it in a different way. And so now I feel like we can talk about finances, and we have a spending plan. That's like language from the class. And then also I feel like there's a lot more peace when it comes to our finances and a lot more joy even, because when you really dig into the word, he doesn't say don't spend your money. That's not what you're going to hear. I mean, you're going to hear like to be a good steward of your money, and that God gives us this and we are to steward it. And there's a lot of joy in that God trusts us with money and that we get to spend it and we get to have a plan and we get to do cool things with it as well. And so for me, there's a lot more joy when it comes to finances, and I don't get mad at him.
That's always a good thing. It's been good for your marriage then.
Yes.
And I can attest to that as well. Kel, or both of you, who should take the course? Who should participate in Freed Up Financial Living?
Well, I mean, it's probably not going to be a surprise. I think everybody in here should take that course. And I think that, young people that are kind of getting out of school and getting out on their own, it's really important because a lot of things are thrown at you in life, and that grabs at your money. And so it's good to start out with a really good foundation. And then also married couples. I mean, it was, we talked about, it was great for us to make sure we're on the same page. So.
And then I would add, don't think it's just if you are struggling financially. Absolutely take the class if you are and you want help strategizing and getting out of debt, because there are some tools for that. But it flows like a Bible study. It's really a ton of Bible study in God's perspective. And so even if you feel like, oh gosh, we're so comfortable, or oh, I manage money really well. Okay, still do the class, because we're all at risk for that discontentment that Seth was talking about. That's across the board. So if you're here, you're at risk of that discontentment. And also God has a lot to say about it wherever you find yourself. So I would seriously say anybody would benefit. And it's 5 weeks. It's not that bad. You get your mind around it and you kind of gain something, and you'll feel a lot more confident about what God has to say about money. So everybody.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. If you are interested in participating in Freed Up Financial Living, scan that QR code or go to our website and we can get you registered for that. It begins next Sunday. It's hosted at our Greensburg campus. Dick Towner, who's leading the class, he's in the back of the room today. Kelby's going to be helping to lead the class as well this year. So appreciate you guys making the trip down here to Batesville to share with us. I'd love to just pray for us as we close. And again, don't forget to grab your envelope if you lost yours or threw it out inadvertently or just weren't here and want to grab one on your way out, and choose to be rich this week. But let me pray for us as we close our time together. Heavenly Father, just thank you so much. I know this can be difficult stuff to talk about, and yet, Lord, as I have experienced personally, I know you want us to be free, especially in the area of our money. And so I just pray for the person who feels so overwhelmed with finances right now. And maybe they can relate to the idea of being in so much debt. I pray that today would be an inspiration and a moment of hope for them to say that you want to partner with them to help them move forward. For all of us, as it comes to the way that we manage the resources that have been entrusted into our care, would you help us to be wise? Help us to know what we need to do with what we've heard today. And then, Father, give us the courage to do it. And we pray all these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.